Good evening, everybody. Nice to see you. So, my name's David. I'm one of the curates here. So, I don't know whether, well, I'm sure some of you have seen the film Titanic from back in 1997. Anyone seen that? Could I have a show of hands for people who are old enough to have seen that at the cinema? Some people, not the owners. Some people probably weren't even born in 1997. But anyway, we, as a household, decided to re-watch Titanic on Friday evening. Although it's actually over 3 hours long, so we only got about halfway through. But it's a really great film. It won a few Oscars in its day, so it's a great film. And one of the interesting things about it, obviously, it's kind of based on it's partly true, partly kind of dramatized, fictionalized story. But one of the great things about the story is that it kind of turns on the voices that people listen to. So, for example, the captain of the Titanic, he hears all the kind of right warnings about icebergs. He knows that the ship is untested, untried, so he doesn't know how quickly it can turn in an emergency. And he hears that it's a quiet night, so there's not waves which would break against icebergs up ahead, so it'd be hard to identify icebergs. But he chooses to listen to the voice of the owner of the ship, who says, let's get to New York in record time. Let's set a world record for getting to New York. So he fires up the final few engines, and they go at top speed. And you know what happens next. The designer of the ship, he wanted to have enough lifeboats for everybody, but he listened to voices that said if you've got enough lifeboats for everybody, the decks will look too cluttered for the sort of the upper classes on the top decks. So let's cut down the number of lifeboats. So they only had less than half the number of lifeboats they should have had on the boats. And then, of course, you have the Kate Winslet character, Rose, I think she's called, and she has to decide whether she's going to listen to the voices of her mum, who's saying, you've got to marry this man who she doesn't love for the sake of wealth and kind of returning their family to wealth, or is she going to listen to the voice of Jack, Leonardo DiCaprio, and head off on some kind of life of romance and freedom and so on. So all those decisions led, you could say, to as far as life and death. For lots of people, although I think Rose, we didn't watch the end, but Rose survives, doesn't she? Sorry if that's a spoiler for anybody, if you haven't seen it yet. So too for us. Perhaps our stories as well turn on the voices we listen to, either good or bad. And I would suggest there is one voice in particular that speaks to us, which is actually a matter of life and death. And that is the voice of Jesus, of course, the voice of Jesus. So I'm going to read from John chapter 10, from verse 1. If you're in the church Bibles, this is from page 1076. So I'm going to start reading from John chapter 10, verse 1, page 1076. So this is Jesus speaking, and he says, very truly, I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. So I'll just stop there for a moment. So my knowledge of shepherding is pretty limited. I remember as a child watching those kind of sheepdog trials on a Sunday afternoon on TV, and there'd be this kind of shepherd who'd have some kind of complicated system of whistles and controls over a dog, which would kind of round up a flock of sheep to go through various gates and obstacles and all that kind of thing. And if that's our understanding of shepherding, then we kind of have this idea that sheep are these kind of pretty stupid animals which are only controlled by kind of an external force of fear and so on. But perhaps we should give sheep a bit more credit, because in the time of Jesus, things were a little bit different. And what would happen is in the villages or towns, there would be kind of communal sheep pens. And the shepherds would come in the evening and they would deposit their sheep. They'd kind of go to the doorkeeper and they deposit their flock in the communal sheep pen. And all the sheep from the different shepherds would get mixed up. And then I guess the shepherds would kind of head off for the evening or something, or whatever happens. But then in the morning, they'd come back and the doorkeeper would kind of verify, yeah, that's a proper shepherd. And that shepherd would call his own sheep out by name with his own distinctive voice. And then he'd kind of gather his flock and head off for the day ahead. So that is the kind of thing Jesus was talking about. And this kind of shepherding, it's still practiced today. I read a story about one of the Palestinian uprisings in the 1980s, and there was a village near Bethlehem, and to take retaliation, a Israeli military unit, they went into this village and they rounded up all the animals, all the sheep and everything, and they put it in this kind of barbed wire enclosure in the middle so the people couldn't get their animals. And after a few days, this woman came and said, look, please can I have my sheep back? I can't live without my sheep. And so one of the soldiers said, okay, well, you've got a few minutes. If you can find your animals amongst all this massive animals, you can have them back. And so she got her son, and her son came, and apparently he played this kind of reed flute tune to the sheep. And the sheep that were theirs listened, and they heard, and they recognised, and they could be identified, and came out. So it's still practiced today. But obviously the key point is that Jesus leads his people, his sheep. He calls them out so that they will follow him. He calls us by name, and though that's what he's doing for us, he's calling us by name so that we recognize his voice and follow him. But what exactly is he? What is he calling people out of? What is he calling his people out of? Or what is he calling us out of? Well, in the context of the passage, Jesus is in this kind of massive argument with the Pharisees, the religious leaders of the time. And so what he is calling them out of is that the kind of religion the Pharisees have made of Judaism at that time. God's law was a good thing, which had been given to the people of Israel, a good kind of sheep pen, if you like, kind of to keep them safe and well and protected and separate. But the leaders of that religion had turned it into a kind of controlling, legalistic system when they themselves neither loved God nor sought after him. So he is calling his people out of that system to follow him, and he's doing it the right way. He's not climbing up the sides like the thieves and robbers, but he's coming kind of right to the front door of that religion, fulfilling the law, and bringing in all the good things that were to follow. So for us, maybe we're not being called out of quite the same thing, but maybe it's similar. Maybe we're being called out of sort of legalism or dead religion or our own efforts, or maybe we're being called out of compromise with the world or disobedience or sin or brokenness or emptiness. Or maybe we're just being graciously called out of situations which are not our own making, but the Lord wants to move us out, bring us forwards, save us and rescue us. So he's calling us out, just like he called his people Israel out. And who are the thieves and the robbers? It talks about the thieves and the robbers who climb in by other ways, not by the front door, so to speak. And I'm not going to read it. I read it this morning, but I realised it was a little bit long. But if you ever want to have a look at Ezekiel 34, it's an amazing chapter. But Ezekiel chapter 4 has this amazing critique of the shepherds of Israel. And when we're talking about the shepherds of Israel, he's not talking about people who look after sheep. He's talking about the people who look after the people, the leaders of the people. And there's this amazing critique of how the leaders have not cared for the people. They've kind of fattened themselves while they've killed the people. They've not looked after people. They've not sought out the scattered and so on. And they've not done a good job. They've been people who have They should have looked after people, but they've taken, they've stolen, they've killed, they haven't cared or gathered, and they've destroyed people. And that's not just, of course, something that happened in Israel. We recognize that pattern, don't we? All across history in many different countries and empires where leaders have done a bad job. They've not cared for the people. They've not done what they should have done. But the good news is that God says, after that critique in that chapter, that he will gather his people. God says, I'm going to gather my sheep, Israel. I'm going to bring them back together. I'm going to feed them. I'm going to look after them. And he is going to do that ultimately by the Good Shepherd, Jesus, who's going to look after his people and bring them back together. Jesus, the Good Shepherd, who's not going to take from people. He's not going to steal. He's not going to amass riches, but he's going to give his own life. He's not going to kill other people, but he's going to die for us. He's not going to destroy people, but he's going to, through his resurrection, he's going to renew all things. The whole creation is going to be renewed by Jesus. And so Jesus, that Good Shepherd, as he did then, so he is now. He's calling his people. He's calling you by name to follow him, calling you out of things that might bind you or control you. He's calling you to follow him. And just as an aside, you might be saying, well, I'm not sure I hear God's voice very clearly. I'm not sure I've heard Jesus calling me. And I understand that can be difficult, but I want to say, by definition, if you are a follower of Jesus, or you regard yourself as such, then you've heard his voice, okay? You wouldn't be a follower of Jesus if you hadn't already heard his voice calling you. Even if you'd say, well, I'm not a follower of Jesus yet, I believe he's still calling you. He's still calling your name. So he's calling you. And even if you don't find it easy to hear his voice, believe me, he's still calling you. He's still got your name on his lips. So we're going to move on slightly to the next stage of the journey, just in the next bit of the chapter, when the picture changes slightly. So imagine you've been led by Jesus out of the kind of communal pen in the village, and he's taken you on a journey. He's led you up into the wilderness or the countryside. And I'm just going to continue from John 10, from verse 7. So that Jesus, so therefore Jesus said again, very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. So this, what's being described here, is a slightly different kind of sheep pen, where now we're kind of out in the wilderness, and what the shepherd would do is he'd go and he'd have a kind of a walled enclosure where he'd put the sheep, his own sheep, and he himself, there'd be no gate, no door, so he would lie across the gates and be kind of protect the sheep. He'd keep them in at night and stop anything else getting in. And that was essential because we perhaps don't understand quite how dangerous a wilderness or a desert would be for sheep. There would be predators everywhere, no food, no water. So in other words, if a sheep didn't come in through that gate, through that door, to be protected by the shepherd, they would be likely to die very quickly. So Jesus is that gate that protects the sheep and keeps them safe. And so we get to one of the I am statements of Jesus. I am the gate, or I am the door. And that, the I am statements are always followed by a the, aren't they? Jesus is not, he's not I am a something. He's always I am the. And here he is the gate, the door. In other words, without him, he is our only option. Without him, we will die. We're not safe in the desert. It's like saying he is the way, the truth, and the life. He is the only way to live. But Jesus is not just concerned about protecting us or keeping us safe. He also wants us to have life, and life to the full. That's what it says. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. But I've come that they may have life and have it to the full. And that's a good question. So do you feel like you have life to the full? Do I feel like I have life to the full? I'm a follower of Jesus. So, do I have life to the full? Well, that's a good question. Sometimes I think my days get so busy. And, I just want to get through the day, get all my jobs done, kind of rattle through the evening jobs. And if I'm lucky, have half an hour to watch the football highlights, hopefully with Gary Lineker, if possible, before kind of crashing into bed at night and then getting up again and starting in the morning. So is that life to the full? Well, maybe it is. But what I would say, whatever any individual day is like, what I would say, my experience has been that if I compare the times when I've been really following Jesus, kind of more or less wholeheartedly, compared to the times I haven't, the times when I have been following him have just been better. Okay, they haven't necessarily been easy, but they've just had a kind of more kind of richness and depth and kind of colour and life and blessing. When I compare that to the times I haven't been following Jesus, they've been much more kind of empty and perhaps filled with restlessness or shame and guilt, or even just kind of nothingness, really. Nothing. The times I've been following Jesus have just been much better and fuller and full of blessing. We had a good time yesterday at the Alpha Holy Spirit morning, and there were just about 12 of us there who were kind of seeking Jesus in various ways. And that was the time, whatever kind of particular experiences people were having, there was just a sense of God's kind of blessing and his presence and his goodness and a kind of an openness in relationships and friendship and so on. And that, I think, was a taste of kind of life in all its fullness. Not necessarily what we'd expect, but what Jesus gives us. So the best way to live is close to our shepherd, following him, knowing him. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, as the psalm says. And so that leaves us with a choice, doesn't it, ultimately? Are we going to go with the thieves and the robbers and the strangers, all the various religions and voices and systems and people that promise much, but ultimately end up taking from us and even stealing and killing and destroying, ultimately because they're under the power of the chief thief, if you like, Satan? Or are we going to follow Jesus, who calls us by name, the Good Shepherd, who gives us life and life to the full? And maybe that's quite a stark choice, the way I've put it there, but ultimately I believe that's where we stand. That's the choice we have between Jesus and life and death. But also, it's not just about us. It's bigger than that. When an organisation faces decline, it has a couple options of what it can do. It can either try and sort of restructure and adapt and defend itself, or it can go back to its founding dream, the thing that kind of released all the energy in the first place. And you could say, it would be true to say, that the church in this country has experienced decline in lots of ways, not in some other countries, but we have in this country and some similar countries. So in a sense, you could say we have a choice. Are we just going to try and adapt and restructure and kind of tinker a bit? Or are we going to go back to our founding dream, and purpose, which is to follow Jesus, to hear his voice, and to walk with him. And when that's happened, when God's people kind of follow him, when they go back to hearing his voice and following him, then things can happen. Change can come, kind of revival and restoration can come. So it's not just about us and our own salvation, but it's about God's people in this country and in this world. So as we look to the future, whatever that might bring, however complex or difficult that looks, let's commit afresh to following Jesus, to hearing his voice, to being called out of whatever kind of religion or structure or compromise or brokenness is holding us in a kind of sheep pen. Let's follow him. And let's journey with him, even if it's through a desert that would otherwise claim our life. Let's find our safety and our life in him. Let's listen to his voice and trust him as the way, the truth, and the life, and life in all its fullness. So shall we pray together? Would you like to stand? And we'll pray as we normally do. But so let's pray. You might just want to put out your hands and welcome the Spirit to come. Yeah, and just as the worship band start playing, I just wonder if, a little bit like we did last week, if your choice, I know of course many people here have followed Jesus for many, many years, but if your heart, if your kind of decision is I'm following Jesus today, I'm making that kind of commitment again for the 10th time, the 100th time, the 1000th time. Just as the band plays, a little bit like we did last week, would some of you just like to come to the front? This is not a kind of a call for prayer ministry or anything like that. It's just the kind of way of saying, I follow you, Jesus. For the future, I commit to hearing your voice, to walking with you through whatever kind of desert that might involve. So it's just an opportunity to come. Maybe we'll pray for some specific people later. But just feel free to come or kind of use space just as a kind of way of saying, Jesus, I follow you.